time are we going to?
We're live, and we are going to probably 4 o'clock on the dot my time. That would be 5. Welcome, everybody. This is a back-to-back show. I just did another show with Nick of the Occult Rejects, and today I have a very special guest. Her name is Clare Kuehn, Kuehn, and we've been chatting for a while and talking about Paul is Dead. And she's not the only one who's talked about this blog that you see here. She's been working on it for a while. She can talk more about that. But I've also had other people on my show. We were talking about Tina Foster. I talked to her in 2018 about Paul Fall, right? The fake Paul. Or Plastic Maca, as she says, which is what they call him in the UK. But I've also done some recent and older Beatles shows. I did in 2018, author Sean McCloud. I did Behind the Wall of Illusion, The Religious, Occult, and Esoteric World of the Beatles. I just published that October 29th, 2024. But then recently I did The Masonic Machinery Behind the Creation of the Beatles with the Sage of Quay, or Mike Williams. And then a new great book, which I highly recommend, Forbidden Fruit, Solving the Hidden Puzzle in the Beatles Works from the Psychedelic Era with Sharon Clemens. So those were all, I put those out all in October. So it's fairly recent. Today's November 21st, 2024. But Claire is clearly an older researcher. She's researched a lot of the stuff and has a lot of information and facts that I didn't talk about in the earlier discussion. So I'm glad to have her. So Claire, welcome to the show.
Hello. Hi.
So for people who may not have read your blog is youknowsometimes.blogspot.com, and I'll put a link to the blog. It looks like you updated it in 2023. Maybe you can talk about a little bit about your background, your research stuff, and what led you to this mystery about Paul is Dead.
Well, hi, everybody. I was very active on this subject from about 2012 to 2020. It's been a little while since I've done an interview, so this is nice. Yeah, I got into in 2008. From about 2008 to 2010, I probably did about 10,000 hours on all kinds of subjects. My actual background is more historical. Both parents were highly educated, very open-minded at the same time. So they were philosophy trained, history, geography, and so I grew up in historical studies and people forcing me actually very difficultly to stop being too excited on a subject and check it out, or become way more excited than I was and check it out. So this was very hard as a child because for me, it created a good pattern in me that I'm really able to pretend I believe something. I can make it work for a day. I can ignore every objection that I know might be there. I can say, ooh, even though that's in the way, I'll finish it off and then compare. I don't forget what I'm saying that is seeing that is a problem, but I'm like, well, I'll finish it even though that's in the way, or that's obviously wrong. Maybe there's something else, and the person isn't the best expressor of the idea. Maybe we're still dealing with something. Okay, so I do have emotions about things like distaste or taste, but I really work hard to have a good method. And the method is not only the logical method of formal critical thinking, and not everybody does that. We do bits of it, but we tend to forget it when we get involved in something or when we refuse to involve in something. So for me, I do have that formal training, but I also emotionally, as I said, I can pull back, or I can let up a ripple of a reaction and continue to the end as though it's very important, as if I were in a jury, right? So a lot of jury members will take something very seriously if it's not a kangaroo court, but many people don't feel that. They feel like, well, I'm going to go arms akimbo and I'm not going to look at this, or this is so exciting and everybody else before me has gotten it wrong and I'm so excited with my ego and my thrill, and I'm just going to correct the whole kit and caboodle all at once. I think it's important to know a case and to work on correcting or being open, and not everyone can do all that. So that's fair. Then we have to come back. So my background is in that way. And in 2008, I went into the JFK issues through Dr. Jim Fetzer and Dr. Costella's work on the Zapruder film. And the book on that is amazing. But anyway, I discovered that there are mathematical optical issues with the Zapruder film that it absolutely has to have been a reprint, a fake, because they made a few errors. So this launched me into a friendship with Dr. Jim Fetzer up to a point, and to going to Dallas for JFK conferences with Judith Mikovits. There's a lot of background noise. I don't know if your thing is picking up. Maybe if you go on mute when you're not talking.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
I just didn't. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So interrupt me at any point. I was just loud. Okay. So anyway, Dr. And then I got into the 9/11 issues. I ultimately forced myself to look at the no planes issues and the no victims issues and the hollow towers claims. Like, this is not something that I haven't forced myself to look at things that other people thought were crazy or couldn't fit.
What were your conclusions about no planes, no people, and hollow towers?
Simply put, they're all partly right. Okay? So in other words, no planes, but there were things in the air. There was CGI as well. Okay? And the victims, there are most of the victims' names and the photos were either missing, fake, strange bios, and so on. So there are problems in the victim record. That does not mean necessarily, though, no one was there. Okay? So there's the certain things you can't get at. But that it wasn't 3,000, but it doesn't mean no one died. Okay, you got this problem with that. Then the hollow towers thing, they were at odds with the I forget what they were at odds with, the victims or something. But they were saying that the towers were hollow, and there were a lot of fake company addresses in there. Now the thing is, those Israeli art students that were spies mostly, who were in the lair, and they were filmed doing jumps a year or two before, they probably, that was actually where you got a lot of the jumpers. But it doesn't mean no one was up there. You get this problem, right? So in terms of the hollow towers, their position was the bottom sets of floors were well strong. The upper sets of floors had floors, but actually had very few fleshed-in floors. They had pans of concrete, and they had the frame in the center. So it would kind of be like you have the outer skeleton, you have the inner column, right? And that's basically all you need. But it isn't that it was completely hollow. There were structures, and I happened to meet the only testifier to the fact that as a child, he said he was in them and he could see way up. Okay? Now, these things, they're coincident. I mean, my point is, I don't take 100% of all of them, and they tend to fight at each other. So in 2012, I was, to your question, TY Jesus, thank you, Jesus, and indeed, thank you, Jesus. I was actually asked by Dr. Jim Fetzer to present Dr. Wood's theories or theses, okay, her work, at the 2012 Vancouver hearings for 9/11. All of the records of that, those interviews were scrambled by agents. We've lost all of it. However, I talked on zero-point energy. I talked on the issues of the ancient pyramids and whether the so-called anti-gravity stuff is an issue, and how Tesla, I got into all kinds of stuff. Actually, some stuff that she didn't even cover about Tesla. So, but there was resentment that I had gone because there was a personal ego issue between the two of them at the time. And so I was attacked for all of that. But I just went to present it, and to present what was also being touted as mini nuke theory. Okay, so I'm not new to these things, and I know the arguments and the people involved, and I've been attacked, and some of that stuff is on the way, way, way back machine. But it was very important to me to actually really learn fully what everybody said. And that doesn't mean I fell for all of it or thought everyone was the best exponent of these ideas. But ultimately, they each had points. Some of them could be married, some of them not. And so when we get into the Paul is dead thing, that's a large part of what we're dealing with There's a core case. There are a few adjustments, some of which I've actually contributed to. And then there are some grafting on what some people would say are wild theories or weird theories, but which I think some of have some validity. Very often those people do not, and I don't mean this as a personal attack, though there are egos involved, and I've had some brushes with some of them. The issue is that if we're going to be really honest, and look, I don't care what's true from the point, if I had to argue 15 Pauls and he really didn't die, and he's in a deep underground base, and he's writing songs, and that's what it is. I might tone it down for some audiences, but I'd remain aware that it sounds very strange, but I do it. Okay, so I actually am not speaking from the intellectual openness. I have my reactions, but I'm not speaking from a non-intellectual openness here. So what they're doing is they're going wild and forgetting set points or not knowing set points. And we need to do that sometimes. We need to say, are my set points real, right? Or if they are real, can they maybe have something else wrap around them that I never thought? So that's interesting that you brought up the 9/11 thing, because that's the kind of thing that I did. I lost my entire Spreaker radio channel. I had only 12 hours. It was philosophical, and it was complete overviews of all these positions. The spies don't like that, because mostly people fight, or they get into an issue, or something is stupid.
Or
right?
the spies are starting the fight, right? They don't want conclusions. There's a lot of Asian provocateurs out there.
Yeah, and there are people who call everybody an agent provocateur too. So anyone I'm mentioning today, unless otherwise specified, I do not consider an actual spy. Okay, there are egos, there are sillinesses, there are ignorances, there are issues where people don't even want to give credit to people. I feel, give them credit, right? I'd rather have a debate. Okay, so anyway, I lost.
You never can get away from that, though. That's just human nature. It's just in any type of involvement in any social environment, people taking credit or stomping on people, or
I know.
It's unfortunate.
I know. I wish it weren't so, because I actually really, I mean, I get upset, but I don't really, yeah, anyway. Okay. So basically, where were we?
Oh, maybe you can say, when did it click for you? Paul said, we were talking the pre-show, how I saw some Time magazine article that, like, this guy had been photoshopped. I'm like, that's not the same guy. So for me, I was kind of like, oh, maybe, it goes from urban myth to I've heard rumors, and now I'm totally 100% convinced that he died, if not was murdered. But that's not the same guy. So.
Right. Well, okay. So here I was from 2008 to 2010 doing about 10,000 hours. I mean, I had podcasts and I had, I'd get torrents. And then I figured out that there were books that had been scuttled on pallets after they'd been printed. The CIA had taken them, and nobody can get a second edition. And I mean, we're talking stuff that is very deep, but there also were some floating around ideas. So in 2009, the PID case became more easily approachable due to the work of Tina Foster, whom you interviewed in 2018. And I'm eternally grateful for her work. And she put up a blog, and she had she compiled a bunch of fairly good evidence, some great evidence, some things that have since been further developed or dropped or whatever. And she was getting them from forums, but fora in the Latin, okay? And I took Latin for years. I'm a medievalist, so occasionally I like to be perfect about that. But anyway, so but we should probably go back from my story to the beginning of the story just for 30 seconds, which is that Paul supposedly died in late 1966, and or summer, some people say, okay? And actually the evidence for that now is highly suggestive that the rumors started right away. The official story of the unofficial story that Paul died is that the rumors were ridiculous college students in 1969 on some drugs who made this stuff up, and a few DJs that whipped it up. That was Sir Paul McCartney's, that means Bill the replacement. He's Sir Paul. The other one I will call Paul, in honor of the fact he was himself, okay? Sir Paul has said that some DJs got a hold of it and whipped it up. There's indication also that actually it was planted. It was seeded, that the public was that the Beatles kind of wanted this out, and some people in the industry wanted it out. The first people, and I'll get back to me, but the first people who were students and others and DJs, some of them, it turns out now, had heard of it before. Some of them seem to have been funneled this information, not disinformation, but that too. And details began to come out as people thought that now it would come out. And then it all was swept under the rug. And those early students, a lot of them on interviews, they'll say, well, I don't know what's happening here, but I think it's serious. I think it's insulting. What happened to Paul? Other people heard about it, and they decided, well, it might have been recent. Like maybe they were just covering it up for the last few months. So there was a lot of confusion in 69, 70. Then it was kind of squashed. And for a couple of decades, not much was done with it. There were a few movie references, but that was about it. When the internet came up, the people who had for a long time been interested in it, or who had believed it for all that while, or who were wondering varying forms of this, they got on the internet and they started on bulletin boards and fora. And on the fora, in the 2003 to 2005, I'm getting up to me now, they were compiling stuff and they were throwing out weird ideas, and there were a couple of obvious disinformation attempts, but they were awkward. And mostly people were just kind of like, well, I mean, I don't know, and this is what I remember, and my uncle said this, and what about that? And so I tend to see those discussions as natural, and they're part of the argument. So then there was also a film, which we now have evidence. It's Ringo, and that's the drummer for the Beatles, and the previous head of Apple, which was their company, and he was a roadie along with a second roadie who were very dedicated to the Beatles. There was Mal Evans, who was killed, and that was obviously an assassination, and that's a whole other story. And then there was this other person, and that those two funded this film, and the film came out in 2009. So in 2009, just after that film came out, I had already decided I was going to look into this. I'd heard about it, and I said, well, I don't believe it, but I've been through so many other things. I've discounted some things. I've accepted other things. It's safe for me. I won't be had. I'll just take it on. And I knew that people were saying BS about some of it because they were misrepresenting some of those so-called Beatle clues. Because I knew that they weren't just seeing stars and stripes and triangles everywhere. So I looked into it and I did a serious investigation. Part of it was that film, which was called The Winged Beetle. And part of it was Tina's blog. And part of it was the fora. And part of it was the forensic scientist who had come out that summer. And also there was this book, which Mike Williams, who's involved in this subject, and Sharon Clemens, that the person asked about, are partly relying on. That book came out also in 2009. It's since been changed. It's really a new book. But the original book was a bare bones disinformation and novelization. Okay, so it was disinformation with a novelization that was somewhat accurate, and a bunch of game playing and so on that wasn't, I don't think, was actually very good. It was an intelligence operation. There are lots of arguments that the man who wrote it is basically an intelligence operative working with Sir Paul McCartney. Having said all of that, yes, the Winged Beetle, but it's about an hour long, the actual Winged Beetle, okay? Now, what they were doing is they were talking about the occult issues, which Mike Williams represented to you in your interview with him somewhat inaccurately, that although he's made that his main topic, that somehow people were not talking about this, that somehow they were not interested in this. That was always a major feature of the case, at least as far as the 1990s to 2000s were concerned. Not before that, because people were just like, what are these Beatle art clues and what's happening? By 1990s to 2000s, you had two branches. You had PIA and PID. PIA is Paul is alive. It really means the official story. Okay? PID is, of course, Paul is dead, But now we have some people who are in PID line of inquiry who think Paul is alive. So what they're saying is, I don't want it to be true, or I don't think I want to make a decision on his death, but I'll grant that he's replaced. They only get to that through the PID line. It's almost like a weird relative, okay? It's like they're in this line, but they're going black sheep, okay? So I call all people who have gone through the PID questions seriously and found it disturbing and have any version of it. I call them PID. Most people would, all right? So I, in 2009, began to look into it. Tina was out there talking. A few others were talking. And there were these forums. And then Facebook kind of blew up with stuff and so on. And it wasn't until 2012, early 2012, that I decided I'm going to bring what I knew to Jim Fetzer's then radio show, all of which has been deleted, okay? His whole show, his whole channel was deleted. So I was on there occasionally talking with him on, I was the one to bring to his attention the so-called fake victims or victims of 9/11. I brought to him various things, just to say. So I went on and I said, this is serious, Jim. This is serious. You have to at least look at it. So I opened up the question with him and I brought it on with a philosophical background and I summarized the case and talked about Tina. Okay, I didn't claim that I had new discoveries. I didn't claim I just took the case on. Okay, now I think it was about 2015 or so, Mike Williams was moved by the memoirs book, and he was on with a woman who was exposing the Sandy Hook issues as potentially an op, which I had also looked into, and Jim Fetzer is now facing a $1 to $2 million approach to him, the way that was done to Alex Jones. Right. But Alex Jones had more money. And what happened was they went after Jim Fetzer in a kangaroo court where they didn't allow his actual evidence to be heard because he had experts on whether the death certificates and so on were real.
That's what they did to Jones too. They didn't allow him to show evidence. So it's a joke court.
Right. But he wasn't showing evidence of the truth of Sandy Hook trutherism. He had been set up earlier to denounce it and denounce Jim. And then Jim was gotten. And then later, with other reasons, they went after Alex Jones and his empire when they needed to. Okay. So anyway, Sandy Hook and so on was coming on. And I said, well, I should come on about PID here. I should present this. So Mike Williams had come on with Sophia Smallstorm, who was doing stuff on, they were friends. And he was so moved by this book, he was shocked out of complacency. He said, I think there's something to this. And if you're really serious about the book, you will recognize that. My point always to Mike was, why do you not drop the book and see what you would have known without it? That's part of a good process where you really force yourself. I think I see 5 Pauls. I think I see 1 Paul. I think I see 2. Let me make it happen and see which fits all the evidence better. Could I have known all this stuff without memoirs? I knew it all without memoirs. I didn't learn a single thing except one grisly thing that most people don't know is in the original memoirs. I didn't learn anything from memoirs. I knew the whole thing about memoirs. So in 2015...
Memoirs of Billy Shears, right? That's
Memoirs of Billy Shears. And it's by a man whose name cannot be Thomas Hugh Harriet originally, okay? But who had it changed legally. And I've spoken to Tom Hugh Harriet, okay? But he dumped me because I wouldn't take the BS part of it with it. I said, you know, Tom, my problem with this whole issue, and I said, no disrespect, but it's that although we call non-disclosure agreements legal, and we call the intelligence agencies legal, actually by ordinary common parlance and hidden from most people is that it's illegal. It's made legal in form, right? They can do whatever they want and say it's a national security state. But actually, they're doing illegal and immoral things. Well, that basically shut it down. Because that's the justification Tom uses. And now, unfortunately, Mike picks that up a bit. where he suggests that we do need to understand sympathetically Bill, the replacement. Of course, you actually have to understand these people. But no matter how bad you make the Beatles, or how much they were into the occult, or how weird they were, or if they did murders, they lost the friend. They weren't happy about it. I'm talking about there are people who make the Beatles really, really bad, but always Bill is worse. By that I mean, even if he was a little railroaded or whatever, he's in there to be a fake. Okay? So anyway, in 2016, due to some work that I had done, I met a man who did a testimony. I got some legal testimonies. I got some things done. I put it out on Jim Fetzer's video show. And Mike was going into the occult stuff, which everyone serious was into that. Now, he's right to complain about people who don't want to see that. I understand that. But it's not right to pretend as though everyone else who was majorly talking about this was only making the basic case or wasn't aware, right? So anyway, yeah, the NDA thing, So of course, Tanya Harriet, being an agent of the intelligence arms, admittedly part of the Bill, the Sir Paul stuff, he is not the man I want to get most of my information from. So if we excuse his book and say, well, he's going to mix some false in with the true, and we have to determine that, which is Mike's point, maybe we can see what we can do without any of it, and then see what we might best base our stuff on, because it's going to be an interplay. That's how I do it. Anyway, so in 2020, when the COVID thing that I knew about for 20 years was likely to be done, I didn't know exactly what they were going to do. I kind of pulled back, okay, because I was dealing with all of that stuff. Anyway, and now Sharon Clemens has come in. So if you don't have any further comments, I forced myself to think about Paul is dead. I learned it must be true. I also learned that there were things that people were saying about it that couldn't be or might work. And I'm quite familiar with the other positions or where they graphed on. Before I go into the actual Paul death case, would you like to say something?
Mal Evans died in L.A. He was shot at 40 of 1976. But like sometimes the cops here in certain parts of L.A. are closer to a mob than law enforcement. So it's very sketchy. So there's a lot of sketchy things around that. And he was probably with the replacement. I think they went to Africa or something, or far north Scotland or something.
No, Nairobi, Kenya.
Nairobi, that's right.
Yeah, which the British Empire had associated. I mean, we could go into the actual case and talk about Mal and stuff, but I'd like to give an overview because we only have the 40 minutes. And
yeah, we can go as long as you need. I mean, it's okay.
Well, you said you had to go at.
I just have to do something. It'll take me 20 minutes. So I have time. So please, let's start there. But there's the Mal Evans is just another sketchy element of this whole thing. Yeah, but Kenya was a part of the British Empire.
Right. So what we have here are agents and assets that can be called upon under certain circumstances. I know it sounds like a spy behind every tree. The point is, if you're a certain person, the spy might be behind your tree, but it's not a spy behind every tree. And then we have concurrently now, we have a spy behind every screen in a way if they want to get a hold of you. So what used to be less thinkable and sound more ridiculous has become almost the norm, that you say, well, of course, but I'm not doing anything bad, so why would they come after me? So we could go into Mal Evans. He was actually shot by, I think his name was Kirby. He was one of the cops that helped with the RFK assassination cover-up. He was writing a book, which we have a letter from John Lennon. That's the main singer of the Beatles, for those who don't know. I know we get a range of people listening to these things. So Mal Evans was a roadie with, and I'm just forgetting his name now, the head of Neil Aspinall. Neil Aspinall was the other main roadie, and he later became the head of Apple. And there's indications that he was the one funding the Winged Beetle with Ringo and all these things.
Yeah, I didn't know that background of Winged Beetle at all. I never knew that. I thought it was an independently researched online thing. So I'm glad that you brought that to my attention.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
Well, again, it's piecing together, like there's a record of money being transferred. There were plans to make a film. The money was missing. Neil Aspinall dies. The movie comes out, and the movie clearly, even with wrong things in it or slightly wrong things in it, pulls from so many things and is so professional that somebody had to have given the okay for that. And the Beatles, unfortunately, as a machine, is too protective of their material to the point where actually using their material even to make a point is often clamped down on. So this had to, like the Hugh Harriet thing, it had to be an arm's length release. And there's some pieces, some little hints, little receipts, if you want to call them, along the way that support that. Okay, supportive evidence. Having said that, Mal is going to write a book. There is a letter from John that says, you know, good luck with your book and I hope it comes out and kind of God help us all. It's kind of in that tone. Well, Mal was killed and it didn't come out and John was killed. And yes, I had looked into John Lennon's assassination and more things were available back then. So to get back to the basic Paul case, the basic Paul case starts actually right when he was killed. I mean, there are actual indications from that period. And it moves forward to a developed case. A lot of people have heard of so-called Beatle art clues. That's what most people were hearing of in 1969, 70 too. But they also were getting some other indicators. And I won't go into the whole thing. And Mike Williams has said, you know, a lot of those people who didn't talk about the occult, they spent their time having to go back over the main case. But I've advanced it so far. And I want to say, actually, we did try. We did try, and we were speaking out on our groups about these occult things, and we did run into the same problem of people not wanting to know that, but it's very much part of it, okay? It's very dark. Anyway, so then people in the 2000s began to question on these fora whether the Beatles were not only into occult things, but maybe were murderers themselves who had killed Paul. Was it a murder or not? Why was Paul killed right after, within 3/4 of a year from when he was going to do a film? You can imagine Paul McCartney doing a film score, being present for the only film for years about the JFK assassination. And it came out in 1967, but it was copyright 1966. And he died just in time to miss the filming in Dallas. And that was a filming where many witnesses died, and some were on film and then died quickly. And it was a legal, philosophical appeal about the case. And it was done by Mark Lane. Mark Lane does have intelligence associations. However, he did an excellent case in terms of the basics of the case and the legal issues around what might have happened, and he interviewed people. And Paul was going to do that film with them. It would have been in color. It would have had round-the-block, ticketing. They couldn't have kept it to one theater, etc. I still believe the geopolitical reason to have Paul killed was the thing either that pushed it over the edge or was the original cause of wanting him dead. That does not undo anything about the associations with occultic stuff before and after. The people who may have done it, if it was murder, and I do believe it was murder, on the day it happened. Okay, I'm not dismissing that. I'm saying that I think there was a geopolitical reason to get it done and the need for getting it done and getting more people okay with it. Okay, so I'd like to not forget parts of the issues while I'm talking about another issue.
Right. Do you think that you have a specific day that the real Paul McCartney was murdered?
Good question. So for people who don't know, there are 5 main options put out there. One was the early option, which was a misunderstanding of a particular Beatle clue, and that was November 9th. It's too late for a series of reasons. However, there's November 9th as kind of an outside date for when things begin to look a little bit more normal, but with the double. There's stuff going on in Kenya. There's a number of things happening. Some people pull back from that and say somewhere in October 1966 because they say, well, we think he disappeared in September, but he was being held captive or something, and maybe somewhere in October he died. Not too many hold to that, but there are people who put that out. There are also people who typically say it was the 11th of September, because 9/11 and 11/9 in the beetle clue, if that's what the beetle clue means, and no one questioned it until I did, if that's what the beetle clue means, then we're dealing with a September 11th or November 9th, okay?
Huge power numbers in the occult, 11 is the prime occult number.
So is 13, though, okay?
True.
Let's not jump. Like, my point is numbers. I mean, according to the ADL recently, 83 is a bad number because it's Heil Christ, and it has this numerical Kabbalah thing, and they say that 83 is bad. So my point is, any number you could be used in a mob or mafia situation of any kind. So 11 I think is close. I will give mine in a minute. And then you have these people such as Sharon Clemens, who also, the first one to suggest this, I believe, was Tina Foster, that Seattle was the place he died, and it would be then the 25th-ish that he would have been killed. Maybe kept around for a few days, but disappears. Okay, so this brings us up to the Clemens issue. The Clemens issue that I have her book. I've read her book. I've listened to her interviews. So I'm not saying anything I'm saying as a mere dismissing, or I just am stuck in something. I want to counterpoint it, because there are things she's not aware of in the main case that are very poignant. They're very emotionally poignant and weird things that happen in 1 week in September, and sequelae, things that happened after that. So that's why when pardon?
Like what? What happened in September that were emotionally poignant, like you said?
Well, I would rather get into the issues around the actual week at some other point if you have me back, because I don't want to confuse people with the evidence. I'm trying to give them a sense of where these people lie, where they fall in different issues. Okay, so the weird week would be around the 10th through that week. Okay, I'll give a few ideas. There were some very strange interviews of people who won an award. They weren't talking about much of their win. They were interviewed at their office. Normally there would be more of a hullabaloo. Normally they wouldn't even been talking about having won the award until they officially came out at the end of the week in the magazine. Paul supposedly had won an award. So the question is, was he at the award? Was he already dead? Okay, I mean, if you're putting it back in August, was he kidnapped already? Whatever, okay? And then there are photos that have been faked, but there are also real photos from that event. So they've doctored certain photos, and yet they were photos from that event because the other people are in those photos and so on, okay? He seems to have been alive that week. He seems to have been in England, at least in the Saturday, because the magazine would come out Friday night. It would be in the stores, and Saturday morning would be the date. And then they have their gala probably on the weekend. Again, maybe not, but, and then they come out with the results the end of the following week. Okay, so if Paul died between his win on the one hand and the announcement on the other hand, it came out as a very weird kind of edition. Didn't have any photos. It claimed some weird things. My point is, there was a bunch. There's more than that, but it's a bunch of weird historical events that aren't even officially PID issues that combine with the PID issues. Now, recently, I heard Sharon Clemens say from an interview she did with a few months back with Mike Williams that she admires his work. She basically follows memoirs. She does believe potentially in multiple doubles, which they seem to both do. And I mean, like literally, like not somebody hanging out at a place or whatever to be a decoy. We're talking about like living as doubles. Somehow it's a joke, or somehow it's a ploy that nobody figured out. Okay, all right. So they believe that. She came in with her, I think, partly excellent examples. I'm going to be honest. I think she's found some actual clues to Seattle in the materials. And I say that without saying that I think she should acknowledge that some of those clues have double meanings. They don't only refer to Seattle. They're also for other purposes. The second thing that I would do if I was she is to acknowledge that some of those clues may not actually be about Seattle. I think some of them, they form a nexus, and others, I think, are reaching. Okay. So the point is that if Paul was dead back in August, she said, well, all the rest of it is just the official story. By that, she means the position that historically I've held or whatever. That's fine. Okay. I mean, I'm actually okay with that. Okay. So then she said, that's the cover story. Now, I want to point out to people that even if it is the cover story that Paul died in September, or it is the cover story that he died in August or November or never died, if we do that to a part, we have to be very conscious that we're just basically saying all that stuff doesn't count. If we do that, we can do that temporarily and try it back on again. But if we just say that whole thing doesn't count, or none of the Beatles' comments matter, Mike sort of has come to that, like it doesn't really matter what they say because they were kind of just a bunch of non-writers and not very good, and they were being played by a bunch of people, and they never had time to write their music, which is actually, you can open that up and show that they did. But even if he were right, if what he's doing to describe it is just to say that stuff all doesn't count. So if you appeal to any of that evidence, it doesn't matter. I prefer to say, well, I use stuff from the PIA, the Paul is Alive official story. I use some of their points, some of the photos. I can't use all of it, but I use some of it, and I try to integrate it into my theory. So the things that stand against an August death, and that also includes Tina's, is photographic evidence, which they laugh at. There are a few faked photos. There are some very awkward, they're really awkward ones, such as a very tall Paul in a photo, okay? But that's to make him seem a little like Bill in the very last edge. That's how I would explain it. The rest of it, if you can go to that Beatles Bible link that I sent you, there is no way that that isn't Paul. Paul and the rest of them are having an excellent time, are thrilled. There's no sign, there's no internal sign, nor is there any unnaturalness to the photo that would indicate that that was a doctored photo. And that's just one example. I do not believe he can have died in Seattle, at least not at that point. What I would say is, I think it's brilliant that she has, being a newbie in a way, looked at those clues, figured out some things, but she's not corralled by anything else, which is an advantage for investigation, but it's not an advantage in the end, because that can mean you go too far. And what happens with too far is you don't even think of the other side, or you maybe call someone like me just stodgy, just stuck on an official story, unwilling to move. My point of talking here is that that's not true. I have my reactions to the point, but I'm not actually unwilling to move. So the photographic evidence and this very weird week and the very weird behavior of Brian Epstein and some other people right around the time of the 11th, 12th, 13th, and following, to me still is poignant, important information. And to say, well, that was all part of the cover-up, I think is ignorant or willfully disingenuous. And I'm saying it's more ignorant, and then it becomes willful as you run with the Seattle date. What is possible, and I say possible having balanced those two positions and where I would stand right now, is that a sacrifice was done, but not in 1966 at that location. That John is reading back in because something else happened. Now, maybe they were taken for some sacrifice, but it doesn't look to me as though they were, like in that photo there, okay? But I think that what happened is after Paul died, there was a sick ritual with the body, okay? That's different than was he officially buried. That's different than is the body in the burial site really he. If I were the intelligence apparatus, I wouldn't use actually Paul in the burial site fooling the Beatles. I would actually put someone else in. And I'm aware of some evidence that actually that happened, which I can't bring forward yet. But the point is, what happened around Strawberry Fields and so on in England is very significant. And there are pieces around September. So the date I would put it actually at is the 13th. And it would be the very early morning. We're talking within 5 minutes, 10 minutes of midnight. Okay? So that there's a clue on Sgt. Pepper's with George Harrison pointing up to a song which is She's Leaving Home, which says Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock when the daylight begins. And this was an old clue, sort of like pointing. Even that clue is a bit misleading, because on my blog site, there is a page which doesn't show on some browsers if you just go there. But if you do click to see web version, you'll see a slightly older, you'll see the full thread of what's visible on the website. You'll see that actually She's Leaving Home has excellent information that it has to have been written by Paul. That would mean that She's Leaving Home itself is both, George is pointing to the clue that this is Paul's song on the album, and also that it was morning. But it doesn't mean that the song was written for the PID. See, these are things which refine our understanding in the light of other evidence. Okay? So there's a whole article, mostly by my friend on my website about that, called She's Leaving Home and whatever. Yeah, it's over. Yeah, I don't know if you'd have to go to the home page. You'd have to go into the archive, and you'd have to click down, and I think it would be, that's the Now and Then. They have totally ruined John's song, and they've taken down all of the evidence on that song. There was a part which I discovered. If you can scroll up there just a little bit, we're moving away from She's Leaving Home. Yeah, that. He sang, Now and Then I Miss You. Now and then, and then he said in a lower tone, I want it out eternally. I know they turn to me. Okay, no one had unscrambled that. Okay, that was the key part. That's why they had to change the song. That's why it didn't come out. Because it was treated, that was the main line. Now in the redo, they use that section of the music, and they do it 2 different ways, so it's still the emphasis of the song, and both are really wrong. Okay, so anyway, back to She's Leaving Home. Paul wrote it. Okay, so the issue would be that Paul wrote it on the album, and also that it was early morning. Also, now taken down from the internet, but available some years ago, was the Monkees pilot project. The Monkees project came out with a pilot edition, and it was on the night of, in England, this would be within half an hour of midnight on the 13th. Now remember, 13 is also a very witchy number, and it's a very Kabbalistic number, and it's the idea of 12 tribes plus 1. It's the idea of Judas being a 13th apostle. Okay, there's all this stuff around that.
No, there's 13 because Satan was there inside of Judas, right? So
right,
Christ sent Satan inside of Judas. Yeah.
Well, allows them, right? Okay, so, but my point is, when we say 11 has to be it, what I would say is the clue was actually for Paul McCartney's name, which was 13 letters on his tombstone. This is the tombstone clue on the drum clue, if people know, 11 IX. He died. What I realized was, however, that all this evidence around this week, and the idea I was going to say about the Monkees thing, they have the man who in the Monkees kind of represented Paul. He was the only English accented guy. He was seen as the cute one, though he was very, very short. And they were coming in to be kind of a Beatle replacement group, kind of very, TV put together. And that guy is about to be assassinated for the whole pilot. He is approached by royalty. The woman whose name was Royal is the name of the only acknowledged Paul daughter, the only publicly acknowledged German Paul daughter named Bettina. Her real name was Bettina Hubers, okay? And so they have Princess Bettina in the pilot, which is now taken down. And the whole plot revolves around madcap, weird stuff, kind of like a 1960s Beatle kind of weird scenario. But he's supposed to die at midnight. And at the very last minute, he's saved. Okay? This was played within a half an hour of UK midnight. It was played in New York and the other time zone next to it, which is the Central Time Zone, first at 7 p.m., I think it was. And then it was played in the Mountain and Pacific North American time zone, okay? So that you had blocks of time zones at the time. I have testimonies, signed testimonies. One of them refused to sign it. I still, if she's listening, I beg you to sign it. You're not going to be in massive trouble for signing something so on the side. I've done my best to back this stuff up. But anyway, 2 people talked to me about the thing on the East Coast, and 1 or 2 people talked to me about the West Coast. I wish the woman who was talking about the West Coast would also get over it, do a testimony, and sign, because it just gives a little more support for those who are open, okay? But anyway, this thing was out there, and Mike's answer and Sharon's answer is that either that was a whole fake event, it was sort of a release that went bad, or other people say it was made up and he never died and this was just, but I find all these correspondences on that week. It's too many people reacting to too many things over that week in weird ways and not connected to like a storyline that I think shows that he actually died just before the release was planned of that pilot. But no one was supposed to know that he was actually dead. The pilot was a kind of knowing, all right? It was a secret clue, blah, blah, blah. Then, if you understand me, then there was a news leak. And this is how these people heard it. They heard it on the radio. They didn't hear it because they were watching the premiere. They heard it on the radio. And I have other people from Australia that heard it on the radio that a beetle had died. More news at 11. The news never came. Okay? So the formal news. Okay, so my point is, there's a lot of stuff right around that time, a few days before, a few days after, some awkwardness, and the behavior of Epstein and others for the next few weeks, into the next month, when Brian Epstein, their manager and friend, though he was stealing from them, when he had a massive breakdown, which is attributed to something else. So I think that that's where the event happened, and how I would interpret Sharon Clemens' clues is brilliant. I think she's onto something for some of them. And some of them are dual meanings, and some of them I wouldn't run with. But I believe it was for an event after Paul died, that at some point the Beatles were brought back for a ritual. Maybe they didn't even know at first what that ritual was going to be. And there's a hint in memoirs that there was a false Eucharistic meal. Okay, so this brings us to the occult portion. All of modern occultism. I don't mean ancient actual Egyptians that were in pagan periods where they didn't know better and so on. All of modern occultism attempts to hearken back to supposed magic, power, gods who walk the earth, and it's all intensely anti-Christ. That's its main purpose. Now in the pagans, of course, it wasn't. The pagans had a mix of stories. They have some stories that actually hearken a little bit forward, that talk about a supreme God, that talk about an unknown God, that talk about a woman who would come, or a man who would come. There's stuff that actually fits when they were eventually evangelized by the church. However, the modern stuff comes through early Mishnaic Talmudic Judaism in the 1st and 2nd centuries, mixed with confusions of early Christians called Gnostics. They blended. The later Islamic tradition, which is very Talmudic, it's all focused on a law, a function of a law. You have to be focused on the law, and a far-off God, which is what Judaism became several centuries after Christ. The original Judaism before Christ and at his time was mostly actually open to what the Christians later said it was. They didn't have an actual incarnate, non-military Messiah. But that was the surprise. That was the surprise. But they had the idea of two gods, two powers, even three powers in heaven. This is acknowledged by Christian and non-Christian, Jewish and non-Jewish scholars, and even a little bit in the Talmud. Okay? So what you have is, when Christ came, and the Jesus mysticism is also promoted mostly by originally Jews, modern Jews, to play down the Jesus story. And I'm not saying all Jews. There's lots of converts, lots of Messianic Jews, and there have always been Jews who converted to the church. What I'm saying, though, is at that period, there were people who were confused about how God would create in his world. Like, how did he come in? Did he not come in? Where does the mystery lie? That became the Gnostic levels of creation that was mixed with what in 1,000 years later was called the Kabbalah. But the early forms of it are already that if you look into it, and there's a wonderful video about this by Will Tucker on Vendée Radio, Vendee Radio. That's a place in France, Vendée. And it's, I forget the name of it. I'll send you the link later. But what it is about what the early Jews and the later Jews and the Gnostics and the Masons and all that stuff, what they claim. And it turns out that in the very earliest Judaism after Christ, okay, the stuff that was not just the Tefillin and not just a few practices, but where it's breaking off from the dialogue with Christianity, becoming resentful, becoming fearful, and so on, and becoming insular. What they did is they mixed in Babylonian stories, and they also had these ideas that the rabbis could go down the levels into the underworld and go up the levels to God, and that they could measure God, and they had all these special numbers for measuring God. I mean, it's very wild what they were claiming. This stuff later becomes Kabbalah, but it also becomes Sufi mysticism. The Jews were dealing with the Islamic world. Okay? It also became Gnostic Christianity and the later partially Templar Christian stuff, and the early Christian Kabbalists. Some of those people thought that they were going to work with Jews. Some of them were enamored by the Jews. Some of them thought it was the original religion, and some thought they would convert the Jews that way. So when we're dealing with modern occultism, they all claim their origin in one way or another from Kabbalah. And they all can be shown to have an origin from at least the early Kabbalah. Okay?
And Babylon, they all love Babylon. They want to take it, all their stuff, all the way back to Babylon. So.
Right, they claim this history. They claim a history back to Egypt, and maybe even there is something to that, but my point is it comes through that. It comes through that period.
Yeah, no question. We're going to have to wrap it up. I got to run. I got to do something before end of business. We'll have to do a part 2, so I'll invite you right now back for a part 2. I think there's a lot more to talk about it. Where can people find? I mean, I'll put a link to your blog so people can read through that before we do another episode. And then we didn't really get to the whole thing you wanted to talk about with American Pie, which we can do next time too.
I'll take 10 seconds and say, Sharon Clemens has recently remarked on her Twitter that there may be something to the American Pie story. She also claimed that Mike Williams, as I think unfortunately he often does, just assumes that nobody wrote their own music. She was saying, she's sort of discovering things about it. I did want people to know all that work has been done. The main stuff on American Pie, I have a huge article about it there in the comments. I'm not the only one, but I mean, I did a huge thing where I took it together, okay, and I showed what symbols they were using at various points, of how it has to be primarily about the loss of Paul. So my blog is youcanknowsometimes.blogspot.com. And I did that because any word can be emphasized. You can feel empowered to know, or sometimes you can know, or you can know sometimes if you're afraid to, right? So youcanknowsometimes.blogspot.com. I'm not claiming I know everything about this. I think Sharon has done some advances. I think Mike has done some advances in some of the occultic realms. I think they leave things unsaid, and I think they're not so good on the photographic materials. And their trust of memoirs. The other place you can find me is at Clare Kuehn. You don't have to, okay? It's on Twitter. So at Clare, it's Irish, not French, so there's no I. Clare, last name German, Kuehn. That's at Clare Kuehn. And I also have a Facebook, which I can't use the messenger for anymore. I think they've blocked me. But I do have a Facebook group, which is the Paul McCartney Death and Replacement Study Group. And I was the first one to call it a study group and treat this as a serious intellectual issue that, really we should be dealing with that way. Tina was doing so, but in a blog. I was the first one to call my group that. I'm not claiming primacy of anything I didn't do. And I'm all for wild ideas, but we do need to remember that they will come across as wild, and that maybe we need to fully consider another position before we only accept fully the wild idea. Maybe something from it can be pulled, or the whole thing can be grafted on. But I think we should be careful. Anyway, and I appreciate you having me on.
It's nice to talk with you. Thanks for joining us. It's Clare Kuehn, Kuehn, and I hope there will be a part 2. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, William.
Hold on.